as you see sports ownership and the asset class ascending, outperforming, public markets and even certain private equity markets, it's been a very attractive asset class. The asset appreciation has been extraordinary.
Hello and welcome to Tuesdays with Morrisey, where we share insights from great thinkers. I'm excited to be joined by Gennaro Leo as we continue our mini-series on the alternative asset market. Gennaro, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
I'm excited to have a conversation today about how sports ownership is changing and becoming more of an accessible asset class in many ways, especially at least an evolving asset class. I want to start with your background and to frame that up. A story. When I was in college, I started asking successful people a question of, hey, you've been really successful. Assuming you've been successful in this, you probably had other opportunities. So the question has always been like, how do you evaluate opportunities across your career and ultimately make the best decisions? And I asked, people, probably as high as the CEO of KPMG was at our school in front of like 500 people. I'm like in the upper deck and I asked this question. Honestly, I asked so many people and I always got boring answers. I'd always get stuff like, well, I never got a better opportunity and I just kept learning and all stuff that as we get older makes more sense. But, when I was younger, it never really satisfied. The best answer I ever got was like an SVP at legal at a consulting client of mine. And he said, man, honestly, I didn't really evaluate opportunities. And if I could have done it again, I would have not thought so long term. I would have thought in 2 to 3 year increments to learn something new about myself and the world. And what I think is so cool about you, you've worked in sports venture capital and private equity, data analytics on both the business and media side in sports, even chief of staff on an Italian soccer team, which I'm sure we'll talk about, and even at CAA Sports. How do you connect the dots between the things you've had the opportunity to do?
Yeah, great question. I appreciate it. And a lot of it was not planned, somewhat unintentional, but having been native to sports my entire life, like growing up in a household where my dad was a coach, ran a organization, a Pop Warner organization, I could just never shake the sports aspect of business in my life and professional career and pursuit. So the through line is genuinely sports, just appreciating the nuances of it, understanding it, having grown up in a household built around it. And so that it really starts there. And in terms of the opportunities, each one kind of builds on itself. So, starting out at an early stage venture firm very early in my career, and then working through all the way to sports ownership. We could talk through specific examples, but it did kind of lead, each one led to one another. We could talk through that in detail if you'd like.
Yeah, sure. I guess the one thing I'm most curious about was if there was, one of these experiences that has been most influential to your worldview, particularly as it relates to where sports and ownership is heading.
Yeah, for sure. So my experience at Roma as the chief of staff on the stadium side, working for the Raptor Group,
Mhm.
which was it's a kind of a venture, kind of hybrid venture private equity group founded by Jim Pilata, and he had taken ownership of AS Roma and asked me to be the chief of staff for the stadium, and not then spending a lot of time there, but under the context of being in the ownership group. It wasn't just working for the club. I had to always think about our capital structure, our board, reporting into the board and reporting to our shareholders. So it was a little bit broader than sport, and it had a major impact from my worldview, being able to be, one of the first American ownership groups in Serie A, and having to work not only with the club, but me being out in the city working with the mayor's office and developers and real estate agents and architects and others. That is a definitive period in my professional career.
You mentioned like something super interesting that's going on, and Raptor was one group that got involved in European club soccer, football. Then you have the Ryan Reynolds and Tom Brady at Birmingham, not even just soccer related, but I'm curious in your view, like how you've seen sport ownership change? Like,
Yeah.
as you think about, like, who were the original owners of sports teams? Why were they the original owners of sports teams? Like, how, if at all, they looked at sports as a business. Be curious to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think early on, even before, my career started, it was very local and regionalized sports ownership. So you had the entrepreneur who owned the car dealership, or the wealthy individual who bought the team because he always loved football, or Jerry Jones. I just watched the Netflix
Mm,
documentary.
yeah.
It was just a passion of his, and I don't think there was real necessarily like an investment focus or thesis behind it. That has dramatically changed over the last several years. As you see sports ownership and the asset class ascending, outperforming, you know, public markets and even certain private equity markets, it's been a very attractive asset class. The asset appreciation has been extraordinary. And as you layer on the different elements, not just like team and tickets and sponsorship, you think about media. We could get back into that and how live sports is really saving media and streaming.
Mm.
You think about stadium and mixed use development, which I've spent a big portion of my career on, and how that has expanded the portfolio of sports ownership. And then owners are really sophisticated folks now. Private equity institutions are now a big part of sports ownership, either at a minority level or majority in some cases, especially in Serie A, for example. So you start to see these institutionalized group have investment thesis and return projections and expectations, and the asset class is performing really well. And there's a lot of different lines of revenue that you can draw from as a sports owner. So it is very attractive in a number of ways.
Super interesting. Yeah, I was thinking about I had a guest in the past, John Sears, who's leads data analytics for the Dodgers, and he was saying, like, look, man, like, we have 40 data scientists. Like, that's the size of like a Series B, C startup,
Yeah.
like pretty substantial. And then, and on a personal, I had some family from Southwest Ohio, like kind of where near Cincinnati, and I don't know if you know this, but the Brown family is one of the last owners of a NFL team where their family business is the team.
Yeah, the Bengals.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
exactly. Their family business is the team. So like kind of like the local rub is that, like, from a business standpoint, it doesn't do much good to do more than just make the playoffs. The incremental investment they would need to, and sure, they went to the Super Bowl a couple years ago, which is awesome, but it's like it just isn't worth the investment to potentially, you know, not get really any more return than just making the playoffs.
Well, think of it in these terms because that is a unique ownership. Like they don't even have a stadium naming rights deal,
They don't. I think they might now. They might have it but like they didn't have a
or they didn't have it for.
indoor facility. They didn't
Yeah,
have a like. I remember when I've lived in Texas for 10 years. I remember hearing some stat that there was like more high school teams in Texas than that had an indoor practices facility than D1 programs that had indoor practice facilities. And the Bengals didn't have an indoor practice facility. They still might not, but if they did, it's only in the last couple of years.
yeah, very much a family-run business. His daughter's running the team now,
Yeah.
and they're obviously doing a great job. But there is some difficulties from a player standpoint dealing with that ownership group in terms of contracts and how they manage those, and they're very frugal, as you could say.
Mhm. Well, there's a lot, going on in sports and sports ownership, and we'll do the best we can to touch on those. Some things I've tracked are like, ever increasing valuation. So I'm sure at some point we'll talk about that. You mentioned private equity ownership. We're seeing celebrity ownership, some leagues more than others, but very interesting. Minority positions, crowdfunding, I'll call it. You could say like it's not a new thing because the Packers have been a publicly traded sports franchise for a long time. Going down to college, you got NIL, which is, pro sports light, you know, pro players earning equity. Obviously, Beckham, Messi, So I've seen Steph Curry talk about it, even though, he didn't participate.
No. There was
Colleges,
rumblings of it, like Caleb Williams started to talk about it
yeah,
pre-draft.
it's all interesting, but I think like the through line for me, or is this just this concept of nonlinear investments
Yep.
in sports? A great example, way outdated, is, when Amazon, you know, paid $1 billion for the rights to Thursday Night Football. There's just one example, but it's like, I had a guest named Ari Temkin, longtime radio host guy. Used to host the Dallas Cowboys radio show, but we joked, it's like, all right, you have an online bookstore, and yeah, sure, they're much more than that, but it's just like when you boil some of this stuff down, it's crazy. And I do think the key is like it's non-linear. It's not just about you know this next season. It's just a much wider view. How do you think about the concept of like these non-linear investments?
Yeah, if you're talking about sports, it really starts with the passion and the loyalty that fans and consumers have for a specific brand. It's very unlike almost all products in the entire world,
Hmm.
where people will spend, their money, their time, their energy. It really is an important aspect of our society, and it's a global it's a global phenomenon as well. So it's not unique to America either. And so sports, it just has a different just a different ethos around it than most products do. And so if you can tap into that from a fan engagement standpoint, from a great product on the field, from community engagement, making your stadium and your venue more of a community facing venue than just, something specific for 8 NFL games, for example, it could have much more meaning and impact. And I think ultimately, if you do the right thing as a sports franchise, buy your fans, buy your team, buy your players and coaches, like that permeates and it creates a beautiful, wonderful product.
Hmm.
And when 32 teams get together in a league, and it's very much like a moat around those leagues. And then you talk about why those assets are so valuable. Well, it's because of the supply and demand. I mean, they're not making many more NFL teams. They're not going to do it. It's like a really high price piece of art. And so you hear some of these sports owners talking about the the supply and demand of it. There's real cachet as well being an owner. Like
Yeah.
a lot of rich individuals that have planes and jets and boats, and they all have access to that. Well, there's only a few of them that own a team and can sit on the floor and invite their friends. And there's a Bill Simmons talks about that a lot, like the
Yeah.
cash that comes along with that. It kind of just puts you in a different stratosphere.
Yeah, I think it's really remarkable. Like, you think about the things that, people are most passionate about. I think where they're from is one of the biggest ones. And then, you know, to be able to, have this manifestation that's representing where they're from is really powerful. I mean, I lived in Dallas for a while. I remember going to Cowboys games. I was like, man, like, working professional, whatever. I was like, man, these it's really expensive to go to these Cowboys games. And I was really surprised when I would see a lot of the fan base, I would say would be, pretty working class, big
Yeah,
Hispanic fan base. It's
absolutely.
just fascinating to me that like it's such a priority to be at these games, and they are electric, but it transcends, I think, personal finance guidance. It's
Yeah, you said it. It's like a point of pride for people. It's like it's representing your city, your
Mhm.
town, your
Yeah,
community. And it does really transcend sport. It's not just about the game. It's about what it represents and how the world views Dallas and who you are and where you come from. And that permeates all the way down to high school sports. There's real passion all the way down the chain in sports.
yeah. I mean, I want to talk a little bit about, we'll talk plenty about media, but I guess first we could talk a little bit about kind of like the real local kind of ecosystems. You mentioned, the role of stadium development. And it's interesting, over the last, couple of decades, we've seen so many different approaches to stadium development. You see transit oriented stadium development, you see like, arena district development. some people, if you go to Kansas City, they went the route of just putting their stadiums in the middle of nowhere. Curious to get your thoughts on just like the role of stadium development and how that's changing.
Yeah, it's absolutely critical and speaks to the asset appreciation in terms of the investments that are being made with respect to these stadiums. And once investors and sports owners started to see the stadium and the venue as a bigger asset than just somewhere where a team plays,
Mm.
that's where I think the market started to change along with the media landscape. So if you think about an NFL season, for example, like the Las Vegas Raiders, which I was luckily enough to be associated with CAA Icon based in Denver. We were the owners reps on that project and on the Golden State Warriors and the Bucks district.
Wow.
And the way people think about these stadia, even from the design standpoint, from architectural standpoint, you start to program these beyond just sport, right? It's a $2 billion stadium. You can't just play 8 games a year in the NFL there. It's programmed 350 days a year. You have music events, you have graduation ceremonies, you have all these, monster truck rallies. You have all these different ways of monetizing this asset, and not only monetizing the asset, but offering up this public service for the community where in a majority of cases have contributed tax dollars for these venues and stadiums.
Yeah.
So it's a place where you get to bring your kids, you have experiences, you do interesting things. And then with respect to the districts where they started to build F&B and Hall of Fames, and the Cowboys, the Star is the prime example of that. Having it be a 350 60 day a year multi-use complex where you could bring youth sports organizations there and have played high school football games there. So I think they've done a really nice job, sports owners, of monetizing the asset. And because they do make a lot of money outside of the league revenue share of ticket sales and otherwise on these ancillary events. And then you layer in the multi-use complexes, and that's why the asset is appreciating. That's why there's so much economic impact from these events. And so it's very much mutually beneficial for society, for the owners, for the team. The better those big venues do in communities, the better for everybody. And again, I'll end on this. Like, it's kind of the final frontier of where large groups of people are spending time in person together. And I just would love to continue being a part of that in this, more and more digitized version of life we live in.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, these event venues, whether it's sports or music, it's really the only time. One of the stadiums I think that comes to mind is SoFi. Like, could you speak a little? And that's really recent. They put two teams in there. Could you just speak? I mean, I'm not sure how familiar with you are with that, but could you speak to that as a case study? Because I think that's a really relevant, pretty recent one on a big stage. LA obviously being a huge, huge market.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, not only SoFi, but the new Intuit Dome by Ballmer. I mean, these are like Kroenke, for example. That was a $5 billion stadium that he self-funded, which like much respect for
Yeah,
doing something like that.
yeah, totally.
But you also know that he did it because there's a real business case there.
Mhm.
So when you have a business case and you can combine that with something that is special, I've heard people have real special experiences there outside of sport, music events, and different types of things. These are modern marvels as well. It's kind of like the most impressive pieces of architecture we're standing up.
Sure. Yeah.
Again, I just have a real passion for venues and where a team plays and what that represents for a community. And SoFi has done that in an amazing fashion.
Yeah, it's cool you say that too, because I'm always if I'm traveling in Europe or we live in Austin, but older cities, you're like, shoot, like why don't they build buildings like that anymore? And the reality is they do. It's just very infrequently and at sports stadiums.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Like, what is really unique, it's not just like some cookie cutter, build. These are, high-end architects with high-end teams, a very specialized, nuanced build. And it is, again, it's a symbol of a city's success and, where they can take pride in.
Did you guys build a stadium in Roma?
It's 10 years in, still kind of in the final approval stages. Uh,
Approval stages, nice.
real estate in Italy is tough. Like they've and this is common knowledge, they have not done a great job with stadia development.
Mm.
Uh, that being said, there's been a major influx of institutional investors and American ownership in Syria. Now, 11 of the teams in Syria, 11 or 12, are owned by American based investors or institutional investors from the US. And Italy has taken it really seriously. They implemented a stadium law where you can accelerate stadium approvals. And so there are a number of ones that have recently been stood up in Udinese, Atalanta, Juventus has one that's a few years old. And then you have massive projects coming online like the AC Inter, kind of the new San Siro and Roma and Cagliari and many other places where a stadium is really an emphasis for Syria, and
Mhm.
that's what's going to bring Syria up in more of a, kind of like it was in the '90s, very respected um, uh, uh, brand of soccer. Kind of fell behind Premier League and others to a certain extent, but I deeply believe, once all these investors take hold of these teams. They implement a certain level of professionalism and institutional foresight, and you layer in new stadia for the team and for broader community events. Like all boats are going to rise in Serie A once these stadiums start coming online.
Yeah, I'd like to talk a little bit about Syria, and because
Mhm.
I think it's an interesting case study of like out of country ownership groups and the impact that has on sports. But I went to a Serie A game last year, about a year ago, November in Torino, Napoli, and it was just fantastic. Like great walk. I mean, Turin is like one big neighborhood. So like you walk from the city center, like, and you're in a neighborhood the entire time, but I'm sure it's like this elsewhere. A bowl of pasta, Negroni before the game, go in there, like, do
It's a
partake.
special experience. Yeah, it's really
Really
special.
special. It's really
Yeah.
cool. What do you think is like the impact? You said 11 teams in that league are
Yeah.
owned by out of state or out of country groups. Like, what does that mean for a league?
You have to also think about it in the context of Italians. Like when we're in Dallas, for example, how many professional sports teams are there in Dallas or Houston? Like when you're in Torino, like there's one team.
One team.
That's all that matters. And they've been around for 120 years, 100 years for most of these clubs. The level of passion is at a very deep and institutionalized level. And so you have these folks that, again, it's their way of life. They build their life around the schedules of the club. And it's very impressive to see just how important it is to fans. And so I'm not saying it's any more than a US fan. It's just growing up in Boston, like there's very few cities that have more passion around their sports teams. But I had four legitimate teams to root for, and you oscillate between each one during the seasons. They're just thinking about one team all year round. And frankly, it's a lot of responsibility for an ownership group, especially from the US, because also there's an expectation where US investors will come in and spend a bunch of money
Yeah.
um, and that is not always the case. I think, just spending money for money's sake is actually could create difficulties for a sports organization when you have discipline and you have a process and you understand how you want to spend and where you want to spend. You just have to explain that to the fans. But ultimately, if you come in and you do the right thing as a US investor with their club that they care so much about, like the returns, not from a monetary standpoint, just like when you walk around the stadium and you get the love from the fans and you see how much it means to them, there's just a really special level of appreciation and love for the game, and in Italy in particular, because that's where I spent most of my time.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. But I mean, so like, there's a lot of sensitivity around that ownership transfer, and it sounds like they build in some, I don't know if you call them regulations, but some sort of hooks into the process to make sure that things are done the right way. Do they make them have like local partners or like board members, or like do they do stuff like that?
No, there's no like real mandate around that. Now, I was with a group that actually did just that. Like we with Presidio investors and Hellas Verona, we brought in folks that had real knowledge of Syria. We tried to maintain the organization as much as possible. They kept the sporting director, who's done a great job, and now starting some real outreach to the community at the venue. Community events. And Idolo Zanzi, the CEO that I worked with at Roma, has come in and kind of instilled that culture into the club and through to the ownership and the board. And Presidio investors have built a great board that are very knowledgeable locally, understand not only Serie A soccer, but international soccer. So they've done a really nice job putting in place the right infrastructure for that team and club and organization to succeed.
I want to talk a little bit about media. Obviously, media is like sports is entertainment, right? It's easy to forget that, for it can feel like it's different, but at the end of the day, I think it's entertainment. You worked at CAA, a media company, you know, Gary V is, VaynerMedia, Vayner Sports, and they're like, pretty relevant players.
Yep.
Uh, so media has been such a big thing. You see where Drive to Survive completely changes the landscape for Formula One, a documentary series. We're seeing the Savannah Bananas, love them or hate them. They're doing something. It seems.
Mm-hmm.
How do you
Seriously.
think about how do you think about media, like
Mm.
how much of this revolution is media related, all that.
Yeah, I think it's a major part because we talked about this earlier, but I fundamentally think that, and I think this has been proven out that, live sports has kind of saved media to a certain extent, like those prime time,
Yeah.
big playoff matchups or matchups on a Thursday night. You can control most of the eyeballs domestically here when you have like folks tuning in to an Amazon game and having to buy Prime to watch that game. And because not only do the local folks that want to watch their local team play, you have fantasy players that want to watch their players play, sports bettors that want to watch in real time. And ultimately, it's one of the very few aspects of our society now where it's appointment viewing. It used to be the Johnny Carson show. It used to be MASH. It used to be these big, massive television shows that have all moved to streaming. And something had to come in and help support the media landscape from a live and also recorded standpoint. But I really think sports has um, done right by the media landscape. And with that, that's why you see record setting media deals and broadcast rights deals with almost every league across the world.
Mhm. But it was always about like I remember growing up, it's like, oh, TV deal this, TV deal this. It was always about, TV deals, and sometimes it's about like foreign markets, like what Houston was able to do with Yao Ming or, some other groups have done it too, LA with their, team members. But like, how do you think about it with like how distribution is changing? I mean, I guess at the end of the day, they're all TV deals. They're just streaming instead of cable.
Yeah, we're seeing especially not only have I been on the professional sports side, I spent a lot of time in venture and early stage tech
Mhm.
with a lot of media personalities. And one of the things you're starting to see where it started in gaming with like the co-streamers and Twitch, you're starting to see evolution of distribution where
Yeah.
co-streamers that are watching sports and kids are just tuning in to watch the streamers talk about sports in the background. So it is really changing in fundamental ways. There's things coming along online like the Kings League, like TGL, different forms of sport, right? Like these different iterations of leagues, like Sail GP. You're seeing all these different forms and functions, and it is being distributed in different ways. YouTube has been a boon for sports. Like if you go on YouTube, growing up for me, it was like you had Sports Center, you watched Sports Center, and
Yeah.
you couldn't get content outside of that.
Yeah.
Now,
That's it. You might watch Sports Center 4 times.
I did watch Sports Center. Now you can go on YouTube and you can look at specific highlights of players and game breakdowns and people doing analysis on Twitter and advanced analytics and statistics on Twitter and other platforms. And so it's been surprising how much sports has grown through these different distribution channels. And I do think it's still early stages especially for the major leagues, where they're now just starting to embrace new media, new tech. They've done it in a traditional sense, like MLB BAM was revolutionary when it came to market, and things like season pass, right? Like the those things were revolutionary for me as a sports fan, being like, wait, I can tune into a game, anywhere, any team, anytime. And now that was from '08 to 2018, and over the last few years, you're starting to see even new forms of media come online.
Yeah, it's super interesting. I mean, you mentioned like, the Twitch streamers and the like, I've heard things about, younger generations. They don't even watch full movies. They watch chapters on YouTube. Like, so you'd watch The Godfather in chapters, which is
Uh,
kind of crazy, but it's happening.
I
And,
know, I know.
now you
Someone
could,
just told me that their brother, who's younger, was effectively taking a YouTube short, putting it in ChatGPT to get like the 7 bullets that would he needed to know from the YouTube short, right? So like this paring down
yeah,
of media is honestly like I don't necessarily agree with watching The Godfather, but you have to understand it and realize what the new consumers and what they want and what they
yeah,
need, and we'll try and meet them, somewhere in between. And they did a great job with that with Savannah Bananas in particular, which is a different
totally.
form for it. But you have to
Yeah,
respect it. You have to.
you have to respect it. I mean, like, they're getting people in stadiums. Apparently they're having a pretty good time, and
Yeah,
they're really like, leaders. I mean, I think they have a product that lends itself to this like TikTok era, but like, they're
it's
really
true.
pretty good at media.
They're great at media. Great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you see this, like, yeah, you could watch football games with Peyton and Eli Manning. It's, probably more for older people than younger people. I remember, you can watch, like, I don't know if they still do this, but like the Nickelodeon version of football,
Yep.
where they have like the digital slime on the field. It's good stuff. I mean, what are you watching most closely? Like, we listed, like, earlier in the episode, like, six of these things, minority and crowdsource ownership, private equity ownership, players getting equity. Like, what are you watching most closely, and what do you find most interesting going on right now?
Yeah, this is, more selfish than anything. A lot of my time and attention and work has been dedicated to helping investors from a more traditional background, whether it be private equity or a high net worth individual, like understand what it means to own a sports asset. And not only here in the US, but abroad, because there are different elements to buying a team in a foreign transaction. What I see is, there's a lot of money now moving internationally because domestic assets have appreciated so much, which is great, but they're a little bit difficult for, investors who have, real funds and real money participate in. If you're looking for a control position and you have, 50 million in equity or 100 million in equity, which is a substantial amount, you actually can't buy a whole lot here in the States anymore with that. So you have to kind of look abroad. And so I'm starting to see a lot of investors kind of open those quarters, and even starting to think about subdivision teams and different ways to buy into teams. Or frankly, I've seen a lot of folks,
Yeah.
PE groups, not necessarily want to have investment in the team, but have investment in Stadco, because typically when a team is not established, but when a team builds a stadium, there are two different entities. There's a team entity and there's a stadium entity, and they have different lines of revenue and P&Ls. And you're seeing now a lot of it, institutionalized investors. There was one recently announced with John Elway, and in his investment group, who are going to look at specifically stadium investments and stadium developments. Or you can even look like a marquee development, which was started by the Ricketts family and the Chicago Cubs. And it was really specific to that project. And they said, "Wow, this is an amazing investment. We did, the Cubs field renovation. We did the around the stadium, and now they're investing in assets around the world."
Mhm. Yeah, there's an interesting story there about that last holdout of the rooftop stands. They like it's good, and like the advertising they did there. I want to talk a little bit about like we've talked about so many different ways that sports drive revenue and value. Um, how do like these groups that you're working with like think about and get their arms around return profiles? Because even like I don't know how many of these things end up in like a competitive kind of banked like process.
They do,
But
yeah.
gotta think, I mean, like people really have to be sharpening their pencils, and small assumptions could have massive impacts on how far like certain groups are able to get in these processes.
Yeah, there are real groups dedicated to it. Goldman, Greg
Mhm.
and Stacy's group on the stadium side. JP Morgan in the city. They all have dedicated sports investment banks now who are running analysis on these projects. I'll just use a specific example in the stadium development world. Um, for investors to understand the return, we run market and financial feasibility studies, really detailed. And CSL Legends, which is owned by Jerry Jones, does it really well. CA Icon does it really well. They're two competing groups. Elevate is a new group that has entered into that market, and you run a really sophisticated, detailed revenue and market demand analysis. So they're doing, what other events are available, what other, how many seats and premium seats should we put into a stadium? What is the return profile? Because that's going to dictate how expensive you can build a stadium or inexpensive, because it's, a lot of it is about what are the financial institutions going to underwrite? How can how can I get this funded from an equity and debt perspective? And you have to have that analysis. So I guess that's a specific example, pointing to these feasibility analysis groups that, serve such a important role in my everyday work.
Yeah. How do you think about like these changes to sports and sports ownership are going to impact players, fans, and the cities?
Yeah, I think I'll start with the players. As these groups become more sophisticated, they generate more revenue, they do a better job negotiating media deals, uh, they provide, higher player salaries. But not only that, there's more opportunities for players now more than ever, because as these organizations and brands grow, their platforms grow. So even NBA stars, obviously the top 5 to 10 always have a platform, but now you're starting to see, guys deep on the roster, because they're affiliated with the Warriors or whoever, have massive followings and impact and are now entering into fashion shows and doing different
Yeah.
things. It's an ecosystem that is, just helping the players just expand their portfolios and access to different things. And as the sports asset class has opened up, you're starting to see even sports tech and investments open up. So fan engagement platforms and data and all that, that whole ecosystem from the time I entered the market in 2008 to now is dramatically different. You see dedicated funds, you see players starting funds, you see PE groups
Yeah.
starting, dedicated sports funds. Apollo just came out with one. Mark Lazary just came out with one. Arctos is a very respected, multi-billion-dollar sports fund, and so players now get access to venture deals, venture investments, just more institutionalized ways of managing their money. And so I think it's been very beneficial to players. And then fans, it's the insights and access. I mean, for fans to be able to, log on to an Amazon Prime game on a Thursday and get the all 22, which is kind of like me nerding out as a, real NFL football fan, like being able to see an all 22 in real time versus just your traditional broadcast.
Yeah, sure.
As technology folks like Amazon enter the picture, you start to see like, better solutions, better products. Fantasy has been dramatically improved. Sports betting, prediction markets. All of this is helping facilitate more fan engagement, deeper levels of passion. And again, it's just like the entertainment product is, in my opinion, just been vastly improved to what it was when I was growing up.
I think it's fascinating. Like like all of the more stuff we can do with like data analytics and every aspect of sports, it's plenty talked about, like the Moneyball and then like the Brad Stevens and now, and basically all of in every sport, data analytics is such a huge thing. It's also interesting. Like I had a guest who is their family owns the St. Louis pickleball team, and they're talking about like all the things they track. You know, they track how many people are playing pickleball in the market.
Yeah.
You know, and then there's a girl that I met at a wedding one time. She worked in the NFL, and she was telling me about how they track like the NFL at the NFL level, follower counts, every aspect of authorized merch sale. So it
Yeah.
seems like the data that we can get our hands on now is just
Well, how
endless.
many places, I mean, like, just think about a venue, how many places have hundreds of thousands to millions of people just coming through there and
Yeah,
spending hundreds and thousands of dollars on a daily basis? Like, there are very few places like that in the world, and
yeah,
so these are just really rich places of data sets, and frankly, if you were to look at the engagement on, like, a fantasy sports app, for example, like, it completely surpasses, most apps or platforms that you'll see in a traditional sense. Like, people spend a lot of time in sports, and so the data that comes off of that is it could create really meaningful ways to either get better products and information in fans' hands, or help just again improve the brand and improve the asset value of these brands.
yeah. And do you see any risk like that we're going to end up in like 5 or 10 years and like all the leagues across the entire world are kind of going to look the same?
I don't think so. I don't think so because even here in the States, like, the profile of fans are dramatically different. Like, an
Yeah,
NHL fan to an NFL fan, I think is very different. And it's kind of amorphous in a way that, like, baseball, for example, people, like, criticize baseball, but I would argue that it's just moving more and more regional and local versus, like, more of a sport that dominates the landscape. But there's still deep levels of passion and people going to games, and they're, going at 80 home games a year. Like, there's something to be said for that. So I think they all have their unique fan bases. They all have their unique ways of, like, the structure in which they operate the leagues. So I do think they'll maintain, their anonymity to a certain extent, like, very different style of football, soccer to Premier League, for example. Like, it's more technical, more defensive. Um, so if you want a specific style of football, you could choose between different leagues because they offer different products.
yeah, yeah. I think that's interesting. Yeah, when you were sharing that, I was thinking about like it might end up kind of like a really good algorithm on the internet. Like it's just going to give more people access to the things they want and value.
Yeah.
And then it'll just all get more unique and specific to the fan bases. Jadar, you've been really gracious with your time. Before I let you go, what's the best way for people to keep up in the work you're doing?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, Gennaro Leo. And in terms of what I'm up to, yeah, very much involved with Hellas Verona in Serie A. Very excited about that acquisition this year. Hopefully, we're working on another one, and also very much supported and work closely with Next Coast Sports, which is an early stage uh, investor that is based in Austin, very respected venture firm. Doing a little bit of work with Anthropy Partners. They're much more on the early stage side of human performance and human potential, and they're using a lot from professional sports, like the technologies and the products that professional sports teams and athletes use, whether that be red light therapy, sauna beds, or sophisticated MRI machines. How can we move that more to the masses? So I'm working with these different groups on these different aspects of sports ownership, early stage, more growth capital. So, open and willing to talk and work with anybody on any front. And yeah, I'm just kind of running with my partner a small boutique agency holding company called Austin Sports Ventures. And we just hope to continue to do great work with people in sports.
Awesome. Well, we'll link to all those in the show notes. Janara, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thank you for your time.
Thank you for listening to Tuesdays with Morrisey. That conversation was with Gennaro Leo, founder of Austin Sports Ventures. What I enjoyed about the episode was talking about how sports and sports ownership is changing through the lens of real estate development in local communities, and also through the lens of digital media. If you enjoyed the episode, share it with a friend, and we'll see you here soon. Thanks. Bye-bye.